there were a lot of problems I'm aware of, but until I actually knew them and talked to them, like, I couldn't have the level of compassion that I do now. And I think like what you're saying is true, is everyone needs to like talk more. And we need to see each other as like complete human beings who all of us are suffering sometimes, and all of us have joy, and all of us, and I think that is something that's like really missing in our society right now, really missing. And it's damaging for everyone.
Welcome back to season 2 of the How We Can Heal podcast. I so enjoyed sharing season 1 with you, and we have some incredible guests coming on for season 2. I created this podcast because the hard times seem to just keep on coming these days. These guests and I have committed our lives to healing work and to fostering health and joy in the world, even as we work through the impacts of trauma and face deep challenges. So let's dive in and let's all keep talking about how we can heal. Today, our guest is Stephanie Snyder. Stephanie's been teaching yoga for over 2 decades. In 2017, she founded Love Story Yoga in San Francisco, and in 2020 opened a second location in Marin, California. She has successfully coached Silicon Valley executives through philosophy and meditation, and she developed and spearheaded a tactical breathing program for the San Francisco Police Department, which she taught prior to the pandemic. Steph was a longtime content creator and editorial contributor for Yoga Journal magazine early in her career, and was one of the founding teachers for Glow.com, where she created and filmed hundreds of classes for the site. Currently, Stephanie is spearheading the online library for Love Story Yoga as well. When she's not in San Francisco with her 2 sons and their dog Slayer, she's traveling the world as an expert guest teacher for yoga studios, conferences, and festivals. Stephanie and I connected decades ago in San Francisco when I was working for a local nonprofit teaching yoga to youth and juvenile halls. As a teacher, she's always been full of compassion, and I so appreciate how she incorporates song, devotion, and love into her classes and studios. If you don't know Steph yet, you're in for a treat. Let's welcome Stephanie Snyder to the show. Steph Snyder, welcome to the How We Can Heal podcast.
Happy to be here. It's good to see you. It's been a while.
Oh, good to see you. Yeah, I know. I was trying to think of like when we first met. And you know when I think it actually was? I can't figure out which came first, but you and I were in the same Lululemon spread a long, long time ago in like 2003, maybe?
The Cow Hollow store then.
Yeah, I was in Newport Beach and they opened a store in Newport Beach.
Got it.
And me and this guy named Gio and this woman named Peggy who did yoga with surfers, we were like the first ambassadors down there. And then we came out in a magazine, and then your face was on the San Francisco one, or there was like a picture of us like, on the Golden Gate Bridge or something. It was,
yeah.
I wish I still had a copy of it somewhere. I don't think I do anymore.
It's lifetimes ago. We were babies then.
Lifetimes ago. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you had your head shaved at that point. So that would have been 2000 back in the day, a long time ago.
Yeah, for sure.
So you've been doing yoga, teaching yoga for decades now. I'm really curious about like your first memory of yoga, whether it was a class or it was just like seeing it somewhere. When did yoga first come into your life?
First was college. I think there was like a course where it was like yoga, Tai Chi, and some other thing. And it just seemed like an easy A. So it fulfilled like a movement requirement or something. And I was really into it. I liked it a lot. It didn't really take great hold until later, but I remember just feeling like, and I was really into exercise too in college. Very active. I went to Charleston, College of Charleston in South Carolina. So mostly we were outside at the beach and running around. So indoor movement wasn't really a thing for me, but I remember really, really enjoying it. And also feeling like it was really hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What was hard about it? Do you remember?
Being still in a pose was hard for me.
Yeah.
Being sort of more Rajasic, Pitta Vata. And And I wasn't, I mean, I am naturally flexible, like just genetically for sure, but I wasn't at that time. I hadn't accessed that at all. So it just was like touching my toes hurt. Backbending seemed like a really bad idea. It seemed like something was definitely wrong. You know what I mean? So it was challenging physically, but also more so, I'd say like mentally, you know?
Yeah, that stillness, that like, okay, let me just sit here and be with myself and not move on to the next thing and keep moving. And yeah, our culture supports that too. Like, just keep doing stuff, keep doing stuff. And then you're like, no, stay here for 5 more breaths. And you're like,
Yeah. It's no, I ended up really, when I got serious about yoga, going for Ashtanga. You know what I
yeah,
mean? Like that fit my personality too.
totally. So
Yeah.
when did yoga become more of a thing for you? When did it become more central in your life?
I was, so I did a little bit throughout college. And then after college, I came out to San Francisco. So I've been here forever. And I took a class because there's like yoga on every corner then and now in
Right.
San Francisco. And I just had this, I was in my like crazy chaotic 20s, like, you know, like temping, working like a bunch of jobs, bartending sometimes at night, like, you know, that's sort of like, I don't know who I am or what I'm doing with my life yet, partying and having a lot of fun. But I remember doing this yoga class. Two things that were really good. One was it was a more rigorous, like sweaty, like it was vinyasa.
Mhm.
So that was interesting to me. I found that satisfying, that it was kind of challenging physically and a little sweaty.
Yeah.
Uh, and then Shavasana, I mean, it's the most cliche thing, you know, but I just remember, and I've had like depression, anxiety stuff for forever. I feel like even saying that now is so like, who hasn't?
Yeah.
But I do remember, in Shavasana, there was like a one moment and then it was like gone, you know, but I
Mhm.
remember thinking, like, I don't know what just happened, but I think that's what like peace might feel like. I'm not sure. And so
Mhm.
it really hooked me. That really hooked me. The two components sort of together. And I got really into it. And I mean, then I was like full on into it. You know, I was doing
Yeah.
it all the time. I ended up quitting my job and going to yoga teacher training, and it just never stopped from there, really.
Yeah, definitely. I can totally relate to just that little moment of peace and then going, oh, maybe there's more of that. Right. And then it's like, you just plow in that direction, especially with the Rajasic, like Pitta Vata, right? You're like, let's go, let's get it. And diving in, I mean, you're still in it. So many people, like, especially in my world, yoga's mostly about, just like managing mental health wise and using it for just coping with life. And so many people are like, yeah, I use it for, because I have depression, I have anxiety. I'm like, you have a nervous system. Welcome. Like, it runs hot, it runs cold, it goes this way, it goes that way. And I mean, we know over the years, and we can figure out for ourselves that like yoga can really help us to tune into that and to tap into it and to figure out, sometimes to figure out specifically what you need, and other times just to like show up and do a practice and know that you have the experience and the trust to know that this is going to help me feel better, right? A little bit today and a lot over the long haul.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the gifts of the practice is insight. Well, we don't get insight first. First is observation, you know, but sort of honing that skill on the mat, you know, honing the skill of observing, you know, what's happening, how am I doing this, you know, what are the thoughts that come along with the successes and the failures, um, you know, why do I get emotional in this pose all the time, or you know, whatever, like having that opportunity to observe without the distraction of like, you know, I'm not doing, if I'm in an office job and I'm in a meeting, I'm not also thinking like, well, how am I doing this? Or what's going on? You know what I mean? But on a mat, you do have that opportunity. So that observational skill is really important. And then the gift of observation is insight. So like you're saying, you know, the management, the sort of self-assessment, the also just being with, you know, really learning to just not have to fix or change, but acknowledge sometimes is the fix. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yes. Right. And just being able to be with, and with that distraction sort of tendency that I think our culture enables in a lot of ways. Oh, well, you don't feel good, just do something else, or, numb it or whatever. But the practice of yoga helps us learn to just, oh, this is what's happening right now. And I can be with it. I can be with the grief. I can be with the discomfort. I can be with the anxiety or the excitement or the overwhelm or whatever it is, and also kind of dip in and out of it. Like, okay, well, that's enough, and that's too much. Just like we do with our bodies, right? We're like, oh, okay, that's too far today, and this is just the right amount, and now I'm going to come back out of it, right? So, yeah, there's so many. I mean, we could probably talk the whole time just about all the like emotional resourcing of yoga, but I'm curious for you, how has your yoga practice changed over time?
Oh my gosh, so much. Like I said, I started with Ashtanga. I loved it because, I'm very type A. So you get to sort of like earn. So for Ashtanga, I mean, I'm sure most people listening to this know what Ashtanga is, but it's, you have to master a pose and then you get given the next pose, and there's a sequence and it's set, and you do the same sequence every day. And as you progress, you get to see your progress in every pose. In my young mind, it was about progress. It wasn't really about like observing, or it was about, how am I doing this day and that day, and you practice every day almost. And so for me, it was my experience of it, and I was a bit immature as a practitioner, was very product based, not so much process based. You know what I mean? It was, but it was absolutely the perfect thing for me at the time. I mean, that's what's so great about yoga. There are so many different ways it is expressed through us. And so I was really, really into Ashtanga. I did that for several years. I practiced with Patabi Joyce one time. And this is how like hardcore I was. It was in the States, and like you had to be, there was sort of a hierarchy in that world. So you couldn't like really I guess you could register, but you couldn't, there was like an order of things. So you had to be like invited to be in the front row or something like that. I didn't really know that. So I just wanted to be as close to the teacher as possible. So and it was at this big theater. I got myself to the theater at 2:30 in the morning, and I sat there until it opened at 6.
Wow.
I know. And there were all these people mad that I was first in line. Because
I mean, you got there first.
But I remember just like thinking like it was in San Francisco, and I was like, oh, I didn't realize there were like sex workers on this street at night. Like there was so much going on,
Yep.
That's sort of like, I was very, very hardcore about it, super committed. I loved it. I loved the practice. I loved Ashtanga. I loved everything about it. And so that's sort of when I got really, really into it.
And then, so from then until now, do you still practice Ashtanga? I know you teach Vinyasa.
No.
I know you, yeah.
Yeah. I did that for a while. And then when I started to teach, I didn't really want to, I did, primary series for a minute, and I just it wasn't doing it for me at all. I also sort of like, there were some repetitive stress things happening in my body, and I just was branching out a little bit, and found just Vinyasa, not necessarily Ashtanga Vinyasa, to be a little more of a creative outlet for me, and also like intellectually developing sequences. I became really obsessed with that. That's still one of my favorite things about teaching. And so I moved away from Ashtanga and just started into more of like the Vinyasa world. And from there too, that's when I started to, like when I first started yoga, I had a light on yoga book, it's like the Bible for yogis, and Iyengar, all the poses. And I had all the poses I couldn't do yet earmarked. Like, going to get them all, I guess. That was like my goal. I mean, that's like where I was coming from. It's so funny. And so I moved sort of from that into starting to get curious about the philosophy and the seeing the way that integrating even a little bit of the philosophy. And in the beginning, it sort of went through me, but it was really interesting. It made sense to me. It tended to help me answer my own questions, some of the philosophical teachings. And so it became much more, I softened up a lot, I would say, in my practice. And still today, I primarily practice Vinyasa. But I would consider myself just a wholehearted bhakti yogi. For me, the philosophy and the chanting and the devotional aspects of it are the most profound and beneficial for me now. And that's really what I try to share. I teach Vinyasa, but I really share that, the bhakti, the philosophy, and I try to offer it in classes in a way that's like as accessible as possible. And most of it really is accessible. So
Yes. That reminds me, I took a class with my friend Carrie recently in, I think it's Green Yogi in Berkeley that took over where Yoga Tree used to be, where Yoga Works used to be. Um, and the teacher was trained by you, and I swore I could have closed my eyes and you were teaching. She started with the chant, and she had the harmonium, and I was like, "Oh, this is nice. I don't have to go all the way into San Francisco. I got a little Steph class over here." She's doing Hanumanasana, and all this stuff. I was just like, "Oh,
yeah.
yeah, you got some mini me's running around." In a beautiful way. I was like, I love this. I love this. So what called you to teach? I know you were just like diving into yoga, and as many of us do, did you plan to teach? I know I just went to teacher training. Like, I just want to deepen my practice. Was that like a vision for you? Like, I'm going to open studios, or how did that happen?
No, I just wanted to deepen my practice. I had no intention of teaching yoga at all. And it really did it was sort of the dharmic thing where, I guess a karmic and dharmic thing where I was in this training. It was Ashtanga based actually. And I hadn't gotten I quit my job to do this training. It was 30 days. I was like, and then it was like one of the only trainings like in the Bay Area at all. I mean, it was such a different time. And I was just getting ready to finish the program. I hadn't gotten a new job yet, but I figured I would figure it out. And I had been in like sales. I was in advertising sales. I was a technical recruiter for a while, stuff like that. And a friend of mine called and said, "Hey, didn't you just say that you are like finishing up your yoga teacher training?" And I said, "Yes." She goes, "Well, I have a friend who's opening a yoga studio. It's a massage place and a yoga studio, and she really needs teachers." And I was like, "Well, I haven't even taught, like, I'm just in this program." She was like, "She doesn't care. You don't have to be good."
Nice.
I remember her saying that. It was so funny. So I went and did that, and I started teaching there, and honestly, it just never stopped from there. I mean, there was never even a pause for me to consider maybe I should change gears, or when am I going to move on to going back to working in more of the corporate world? Like that I never even had a breath to take in that direction, because it just, from there, kind of went, and I loved it. And I did tons and tons more training. And so it just sort of happened that way. It just sort of took me for a ride.
Yeah, it took on its own energy, and and it keeps going, right? Now you've got the 2 studios, right, in San Francisco and Larkspur. Yeah, and tons of trainings and everything going on, so it's still accelerating, it seems like.
Yeah, I think you always have to be evolving as a teacher too. Otherwise it becomes just, I don't know, I would become very bored. And yoga is supposed to be alive within us, right? So
yes,
if we're building and growing and integrating all the time, it loses its life. And so I don't know how you would teach without evolving as a teacher. And you only evolve as a teacher because you're evolving as a student. I mean, studentship is the most important thing for any teacher. So I have a Love Story Yoga in Larkspur and in San Francisco, and that's just been like a total heart project. And it's been a great experience. I've learned a ton. So it's been really, really wonderful. I feel grateful that we made it through the pandemic and everything too. That was
that's huge. A lot of studios shut down and have been really impacted, but it seems like you guys, went into hibernation a little bit, as everybody had to, but came out strong. So it's beautiful to see.
Yeah, I'm really grateful. We have a great community.
It's its own whole practice too. I mean, from what I've seen as a teacher in studios, managing a studio, running everything, that's its own level of yoga practice right there. Like everything on the mat applies.
But I do have a really good team of people. So honestly, that's true. I really try to protect like my time and my role in this as yoga focused, and have a really, really great, incredible team of people who help manage a lot of the other things, because that was important to me also, because you're right. I've seen a lot of teachers open a studio and you just get so bogged down that they stop teaching. And I just was wary of that. So I try to I try to do what I'm great at, and then, to the best of my ability, and then recruit people who are really great at stuff that I'm terrible at.
Yes.
And that I don't do it all. That's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. You've been doing something interesting lately. Laurel, is one of these wonderful people that works with you, who used to work with Yoga Works when I was teaching there. She was telling me you were doing some work with, is it the San Francisco Police Department or the Sheriff's Office? I think it's the Police Department.
Yeah. This was before the pandemic. The San Francisco Police Department, we have a station right down the street from us in Valencia, on Valencia Street in the Mission in San Francisco. And they either walked in or called and just said, hey, we're wondering if you guys kind of do any kind of like, anything to help with stress reduction. And they didn't even know what to ask for because they didn't really know about yoga or anything, but it was something that they were looking for. So Laurel let me know, and I got in touch with them immediately because that was like very intriguing to me. And it was such an incredible experience. And we haven't gotten back on track since the pandemic. But I would go in once a week, and they called me the breathing lady. And I'd go in right after their meeting, and where they sort of get like the download of everything going on when there was changing shifts. And I would sit down with them, and they would close their eyes, and I would take them through pranayama exercises, and to help them, build resiliency, build, heart rate variability, that kind of thing. I explained to them how the breath could help them with that in stressful situations and why that's beneficial. And it was just such an incredibly rewarding experience. I mean, and I got to be friends with a couple of these guys, and one of them said, you don't realize what a big deal it is for a room full of cops who have guns on them for you, and they're on duty. So they're in hyper vigilance already when they're on duty, right? And a lot of them have trouble getting out of that too. He said, to ask a group of cops who are on duty to sit down and close their eyes.
Insane, right? Like it seems almost impossible.
That part didn't even occur to me. So yeah. I learned so much just from working with them, talking with them, understanding more of like what they're exposed to and what the demands of their job. I mean, all symptoms of just being, like I said, hypervigilant all the time. And they're not the only profession that struggles with this. I mean, incredibly high rates of suicide. So, it gave me a lot of insight and compassion. There's definitely bad apples in every group, but by and large, great guys, really dedicated to their job. And, I give them credit for coming to us and asking for this. I mean, that's amazing. And I know it's San Francisco, so there is that. But then it was just very successful, and other stations started asking for it. And I ended up meeting with the chief of police. They actually gave me an award, which is really nice for just because we did it all volunteer. We were in several stations all over the city, and it was like the only place in the country that had adopted a program like that at that scale. So it was really exciting. And, hopefully we'll get back to that, but it was rewarding, and they found it helpful. The police officers found it really helpful. So that's all that mattered to me.
Yeah, if you get that going again and, have that team of teachers, I'd be happy to contribute some training, or at least, books or audiobook if they're, just on yoga for trauma recovery as a backdrop to everything else you're doing. Because, we don't think asking someone to close their eyes is a big deal. As yoga teachers, a lot of us that are teaching, that's a resourceful space for us. Like, oh, let me close my eyes and feel into that little shavasana feeling you're talking about before and connect with myself. But when you're in, or also, any kind of emergency response, I think of people who work for ambulances, for example. It's like when you are in these emergency situations and you're on, that's a big ask. And also if you've had, which lots of folks going into emergency professions do, they're like, oh, I just happened to work really well in chaos. And you're like, well, where did you grow up? And what was that like? Oh, it was a civil war. Oh, isn't that interesting? Right? Like, oh, there was a lot of abuse. Isn't that interesting? So you ask folks too that have a history of their own personal trauma to close their eyes and kind of go inside. And that's a big ask. And so I think, it says a lot to your building relationship with them and everything you said in terms of explaining, hey, this is how this can help you. This is how this can help you do what you're trying to do better. It's like, oh, okay. Then there's some connection and then there's some like, this is worth it, even though it still might be hard, right? To actually like, I have guns on me and let me close my eyes when your eyes are such a resource for safety.
Right, right. I mean, they're scanning for danger all the time. That's their job. And it's hard for them to not do that when they're not on duty. It just becomes, it's a really tough job. I mean, there's so much wear and tear emotionally and psychologically that they go through. So yeah, it was a great learning experience for me, extremely rewarding. And I just felt like, at least a tiny part of a solution, you know what I mean? With all of the violence and everything going on, that we were able to contribute in a way that was helpful, to help them manage the stress that sometimes can go wrong, in their professions. It was really rewarding. I hope we get it back on track.
Yeah, I run an online training program, and within that group of students and graduates, there was a rich conversation in the last couple of years around there are folks in there who teach yoga to law enforcement, and there are folks in there who teach yoga to people who have been negatively impacted by law enforcement, right? And so there's this really rich conversation in that. And I think what you just mentioned and what came out of that conversation was just this perspective of compassion of what everyone is going through, right? And I think there's an extra layer in San Francisco. I'm familiar somewhat with the sheriff's department and some of the systems there, and helped get some small yoga classes that stayed for a few years and left in different places. But it's a really diverse community. The staff there, like the people who work for SFPD or the sheriff's department or who work in the jails and the hospitals there, it's a really diverse community. So there's so many layers to this, especially when we start talking about race and police brutality and all those things. And so there was a really rich conversation. And I do feel like that piece of compassion for everyone who's impacted by violence and trying to build more awareness of the things that you were talking about. Heart rate variability, stress tolerance. Oh, I am in hyperarousal all the time. How might that impact me if I have guns, right? Like just basic awareness like that. And I don't mean to, to insinuate that people aren't thinking about these really obvious things, but we're not either as teachers. We're not thinking about, oh, close your eyes, it's going to be hard. So there's sometimes these things that are become apparent and become sort of obvious, but they're not right away, right? We're so caught up in whatever we're caught up in that it's not obvious right away that there's a lot of trauma going on behind the scenes. And there's a lot of tools in yoga that can help with that. And so again, in this conversation, it was kind of like, why not give the tools that can heal everywhere? Like that's going to help everybody, right?
Yeah, I like the compassion piece. That what you just said is also, it's so easy for us to be, and we're so like in such camps these days, in terms of like other, and I am I am generally like anyway, I didn't have anything huge against the police, put it that way, okay? Yeah. But there were a lot of problems I'm aware of. But until I actually knew them and talked to them, like I couldn't have the level of compassion that I do now. And I think like what you're saying is true, is everyone needs to like talk more. And we need to see each other as like complete human beings who all of us are suffering sometimes, and all of us have joy, and all of us, and I think that is something that's like really missing in our society right now, really missing. And it's damaging for everyone. So if I put you out of my heart, it's damaging for you, but it's more damaging for me, actually. So I think that compassion piece, and really, like you're saying, like you have two sides of that coin. But for them to be able to see each other and talk to each other and understand each other, I mean, I would come in, I had to finally be like I came in one time and this one officer, Mike, was like, he just told me a story. He's like, oh yeah, this is what happened last night. Some of the guys are really off, and I won't repeat it. And
I'm just filling you in on the news, and it's like the biggest, most traumatic thing you've heard in a long time.
ever. I still never can stop. It's in me forever now. Like, and so that also was just like, wow, he's just like reporting that. And yet how I was feeling it, so that also gave me a whole nother level of compassion. I mean, that's what they're exposed to so much all the time that they have to manage. Anyway, so yeah, the compassion piece is huge. I think just like seeing each other and talking to each other and having conversations, being able to ask questions and being able to be wrong and being able to make it right and apologize. But in general, the whole cancel culture and all that kind of thing, the way that we're just immediately ready, as a society to, put someone in the guillotine in the town square, and that's that. And the big problem with that I see is it completely ends communication. So there's so much fear around asking the wrong question or doing something. People do wrong things or have bad judgment like all the time. And we have to have the space, I think, to acknowledge and make amends, whatever that means. And it's important for the person who has been traumatized in some way, maybe, to have the opportunity to hear that, or to have the opportunity, if they want that, to have the opportunity to have that conversation. It can be healing for them as well. So I just feel like that conversation has completely, it's been diluted to almost nothing now. I mean, it's just, there's no conversation. It's like, you're right or you're wrong. And that's that. No one person is all the way right and all the way wrong. No one person is all the way perfect and all the way imperfect. Like, it just doesn't work that way. So it's very painful for us as a society to live in that kind of, binary existence that is just not rooted in any kind of reality, So I think it's stunted us in such a way that has created a lot of collective pain.
Yes. It stands out to me as you're talking. I mean, we're making so much progress around gender inclusivity and sort of being non-binary in that sense. And so can we let that feed other ways we're thinking in terms of, and it's, I say this a lot in cognitive behavioral therapy. In cognitive therapy, one of the biggest cognitive distortions is all or nothing thinking. Like, it's always right or it's always wrong or this or that. It's like, it's just so rare, right? That something is maybe in coding when it's like a 1 or a 0 or something, right? But when we start talking about humans, we're so complicated and complex, and life is so complicated and complex. And so when we can get into more of the nuance and ask questions, and especially when you talk about me holding you in my heart, and how that benefits me, how that benefits you, how that benefits us as a collective. And I've seen it a million times where people start to get to know each other and ask questions and go, oh, I didn't think that of you at first. I totally had you in this box, especially if they're wearing a uniform, or especially, it can be based on how we're dressed. It can be based on our skin color. It can be based on all these things. So I agree that the curiosity and the compassion and the conversations are helpful, and that's not that different than what we're doing individually as a single person on a yoga mat, right? Like, let me be curious. Let me try to put these judgments aside. Let me try to be with what's happening without, this is one thing I remember, you always remember certain things that teachers say. I remember you talking about cutting and running without cutting and running, right? Like, let me be with this without just being like, I'm a cut and run. I'm a cut and run. I don't think we talk about that enough these days, of how much of an impulse that is to just put up a wall and go a different direction. I don't know. That was something I remember you talking about. Is that like a big theme for you, or is that something you still think about, cutting and running?
Well, I think, in the teaching context, one of the things I'll bring up now and then is, because I teach a rigorous practice too, it's demanding physically. And generally we're either like someone who's going to push harder than we should or need to, which is a waste of energy, and damaging, I think, energetically and psychologically on some level. Or we're like a bailer, we cut and run when it's uncomfortable. So that's kind of what on the mat, notice like, what's your pattern? Like, what's your flavor that you always pick, and try something else. If you're someone who wants to bail, cut and run, or you're someone who's like really push, maybe you soften back. And if you want to cut and run, maybe you stay with it, but without that aggression. Just try a different way. And it's just interesting to notice, because the way we do things, the late great Larry Schultz always used to say, he was one of my Snyder teachers. He used to say, he was from New York. When we were on the mat doing a pose, he'd go, the way you do this here is the way you do everything everywhere, and it was so true. So that's just speaks to that, observing on the mat. How are we handling challenge? What happens when we're bored? What happens when we don't get what we were expecting or think we needed or wanted, and we get to watch how and it's always a habit, what our habits are showing up in those moments. And then we can decide, do I want to change that or not? And then there's power in that choice. We don't usually even know we have a choice because we're not paying attention.
Right. It's just happening in the background. But then once you realize, oh, this is what's happening, you get that observation, that insight, that choice. Like, well, why would I choose the thing that causes me more suffering? Right. Right. And sometimes we can be really attached to the things that cause us suffering too, really attached to that judgment or really attached to that pushing because it's going to get me somewhere that's better, even though I'm learning that it's actually not.
My self-worth is attached to it, or, those questions are really so valuable because you can, in yoga, the klesha karma is like, we're meant to go back to trace back to like where that started. And then we can work with that. Sometimes, and sometimes we can't, sometimes we can't trace it back, but that, is information that's really valuable and that we can use to heal.
No. It's so much like therapy too. It's just without the other person's sort of insight and feedback from their observations of you, but it's still that, projection onto your mat, onto the person next to you, onto the teacher. And I think when we at least have that umbrella of awareness of, let me just observe all this stuff as it's happening, then there's so much we can learn, like you said, about everything that happens off the mat. Oh, well, maybe I'm doing that here. Maybe I'm pushing. Maybe I'm judging. Maybe I'm being critical. Maybe I'm being self-critical. And starting to sort of piece those patterns apart that, for many people, many lifetimes, just like, it's not a point of observation. It's not a point of awareness, right? It's just plow forward right? And keep doing that.
Which is, I think that requires tools. Not many people are just naturally going to step back like that, especially in today's world. It's so busy, but I think being able to pay attention and get interested in it. For me, that's one of the things I love about the philosophy. Like, it's so interesting. There's so many ways in to that observation that are smart and gentle and sometimes difficult, but never damaging. And so therapy wise, when you say that, that's another reason why I love to teach the philosophy, and in teacher training in particular. We spend a lot of time on, for instance, just the yamas and niyamas. Those are like the ethical sort of guidelines of living as a yogi. And so for the yamas, let's just say, satya is the second one. That's honesty. And so when you first, you're in the group and you think, okay, so, pretty much everyone's like, I'm an honest person, and, but what does that mean? So what happens if someone asks you a question and the answer is uncomfortable? Like, do you tell the truth or do you sort of skirt around it? Well, that would violate satya. Well, why do you do that? Well, how could you do it better? So, we spent an entire week on ahimsa, an entire week then on satya down the line. And it's just for self-assessment to say, like, to really like hold ourselves accountable. Because it's easy to say, I'm an honest person or I'm a whatever. And that relates back to the childhood thing too. When we're kids, we just take on the worldview of the world around us. So we don't question it. And it becomes part of who we are until we decide to question it. So, working with the philosophy in that way too, it's a real sadhana. Sadhana is a very specific, dedicated practice. I'm going to practice satya, honesty, to the best of my ability. It's going to be my one primary focus for an entire week. And then at the end of every day, it's called swadhyaya, self-assessment, basically. I would just write down, how did it go? And not in a judgy way, but in a way that I can learn. And if something went wrong, I would just ask myself, how would I do it differently next time? And then I would write it down. And the way that I just took a minute to pay attention to it, I took a minute to contemplate what I might do differently next time. And then I wrote it down as a way of a commitment. And the reason why that's important is not because we want to become these like, we don't have to become these puritanical sort of like, monks in the world, but because that process, the next time that situation comes up, and it always will, you have that in your consciousness and you might do the different thing, or you might think of doing the different thing, but not do it. But the next time you'll think of it and do, so it works like that. So it's really constructive. The philosophy is a great way to help us take those observations and actually put them to practice. So it's important that maybe I already said this part, but that observation I get from that, looking at that in a focused way gives me information that I can then use to actually put the insight that I gain into practice in my day-to-day life in a way that's real. And so we don't just want to recite the sutras, we want to live the sutras, And so that's the key. And so that's where, yoga is, at some point the rubber has to meet the road. And, that happens at, different pace for everyone, of course, but the gift is there for us, when we want to move towards it. And you can apply if there's any pain point in my life, I turn toward the text and ask myself, like, okay, what tool can I use? And then I make a sadhana. It's a commitment. If we want to make change in our lives or change a behavior that's maybe damaging or change, for me or someone else or whatever it is, there are tools, and I can go and really engage those tools and then apply the teachings in a way that helps me actually change the way I'm living in the world. That's all that matters, really, for us at this point. It's really important.
Yeah, 100%. And I love what you're sharing because it re-centralizes the focus of yoga on the philosophy, which is so much more accessible, right? Like having a conversation with yourself about non-harming or truthfulness, like that's something I think most of us can access, right? Just having that conversation, just asking, well, am I practicing ahimsa? Am I practicing satya? What do those concepts mean to me? What do they mean in the context of my life? Like those are things we can chew on individually and together. And we don't have to be super mobile. We don't have to take a certain shape in our body. We don't even have to lie down and do shavasana, right? And I think there's so many different things within yoga, the physical asana, the breathing practices, the philosophy, there's all these tools in there. And sometimes I hear this, like, the classic, like, well, I'm not flexible, so I don't do yoga, which there's that. But then there's also just then there's the intimidation factor or the accessibility factor of, well, that's like not working for my body or not what doesn't feel right for me right now. Well, there's all these other angles that I think can be immensely helpful. Even svadhyaya, right? Like just self-study. That might be you going to therapy. That might be you writing in a journal, but that can be part of your yoga practice. And if or when the other things become helpful, great. But we don't have to just judge it based on like, how long can you hold your handstand or whatever it is, like things that sometimes as a yoga culture, we can kind of get distracted even with like you were saying, like, I'm going to do every pose. I'm like that. Wow. There's some of those in there. I remember like the first time I looked at Line on Yoga, I was like, well, that's not going to happen, which is a whole other like thought and response, right? That I can work with. So you've said a lot of things already that I think are helpful, but what would you say to someone who we've been going through it the last few years? I mean, it's been kind of nonstop in terms of processing trauma, in terms of just going through hard times. And I know it's unique in a lot of ways, but like also that's life. Like if you look back, I think about my grandma's life. I'm like, she went through world wars. Like there's hard stuff. So what would you say to people who are really just struggling right now?
Oh, people and me. Hello. Like who's not? I mean, I'm in a struggle. I think it's difficult because my sense is that we all want to move on, from what just happened. And we don't talk about it anymore. We don't want to we're just like, let's get back. But we do need to spend time processing the trauma of the last few years, of the social isolation, of the incredible, as a mother, just the homeschooling and the turning my house into a yoga studio and the insanity of managing all of that. Of the great and deep loss that the entire world experienced. And so I do think that it's important when something comes up, that feels uncomfortable, a memory about that, or just to like, acknowledge that it was very, very difficult. It was extremely painful. It was uncharted territory for anyone who is alive, and to just give ourselves permission to.
Yeah.
That was a lot.
Yeah.
And I still am carrying that, and I will, unless when it comes up over and over and over until I'm, found that homeostasis again in some way. So there's that, just acknowledging what we've all been through and letting it come up and grieve when that happens, or feel grateful when that happens, but be with, there's gonna be a lot of residual, just everything from this. So just to acknowledge that. And then the other thing I would say is, one thing that I've been working with is when we, like, for instance, we just opened the studios back up, and then there was another variant, and we had to go back off and on. And then, it's like monkeypox and whatever. I found, because we went so far from one direction to another in the pandemic of like being shut down, and there's a longing for the past that became hardened a little bit, I'd say. And I don't think I'm alone in that. And it's become a bit of a like thought pattern, so everything, something even goes wrong a little, it's like triggers this like, oh, like, here we go again, or something like that, instead of just recognizing, yes, like you said, this is life. It's always something. That's true. And to just to unhook from that feeling very restricted by and restrained by circumstance that doesn't necessarily feel ideal in the moment. That is this moment. It's not the pandemic moment, but I feel often like that's coming through the trauma of that, of things being different or not working out or whatever it is. So I would say, I'm practicing just really trying to be present with what's in front of me, and recognize when that's coming through as just sort of some still some trauma that needs to be processed from the pandemic. And it's important to recognize that, because otherwise, I will react in a way that's inappropriate, right? If it's informed by something that's not actually happening right now. So it's important to just take a moment and then, okay, you know what, this is a thing. It's not that big a deal, and we're going to carry on. And I think I had a lot easier time doing that before the pandemic. And I just noticed it's harder for me now to bounce back from things that are stressful. And so that's a practice. It's a practice. And it'll help me both heal from the pandemic and also help me moving forward into this, whatever it is right now,
Yeah. And there really is always something. I just relatively recently saw some memory on social media or something that popped up that was like, I know it's been a rough year for so many people. And it was like, I don't know, 2014 or something. It was like some random year that I don't remember why that was a hard year. I remember why 2020 was a hard year. But like, I think there's something about how we're not only looking inward and processing our own trauma, which I hope we're doing, we're doing to the best degree we can. But because we're so interconnected now, we are processing global trauma. And even like back in 2014 or whatever year that was, yeah, I might have been talking about like a terrorist attack in Paris, or I might have been talking about a tsunami in Thailand, or there's always some natural disaster, some political strife, or a war, or a pandemic, and I'm not, trying to measure these things against each other, because I don't think that's useful, but just to point out, and I think this kind of goes into Buddhism a little bit, of like life contains suffering, and how do we react to that? What do we do with that? And I know from my experience, and I think you share this, of like having a practice that's, in our case, inspired by yoga and yoga philosophy, and moving and breathing, having an embodied practice, having a physiological practice where you're working to build up your resilience in your body. Like, it helps. It really helps. It doesn't mean, oh yeah, I went through a pandemic and I'm totally fine. But it means that we have some tools that we can share with each other, that we can use, that we can remind each other when we forget, we can come back to, and sometimes coming back to those basics and just being a beginner again and again is hard, but it's helpful to have somewhere to land, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's helpful to go, I haven't really been aware of my breath today and I'm feeling really off. Just like it's helpful to say, I'm feeling really off and I haven't eaten anything today. Like, let me go back to those basics, or let me go back to how I'm talking to myself, and where is the ahimsa there, right? So I think there's these really solid touch points within yoga, and you can share them with people being impacted by police brutality. You can share them with people in law enforcement. You can share them far and wide. And I think the impact of those is, like you described for yourself, that softening, and that in that softening, we have more of an opportunity to connect and hopefully move through, right? Be with, move through, resolve, and just keep living and remaining connected to our hearts, right?
Accepting the world for what it is. We do what we can to make it better, but a lot is out of our control, and we have a hard time accepting that and accepting however long it takes for us to process trauma. And accept, a lot of the acceptance too, like we're fighting with ourselves internally often, I'd say. And so that acceptance, that's another practice of yoga, samtosha. Practicing contentment is a really strong muscle to build, because it gives us a stronger container to do the hard work.
Yeah. Yeah. What gives you hope these days?
My children, my dog, any sunny day. And I feel, generally it's ironic, because I have dealt with depression, anxiety my entire life, like since I was like 8 years old. But the funny thing is, I kind of always have a feeling like things are going to work out, though, at the same time. So you can analyze that. I don't even want to begin, but so I generally have kind of an optimistic outlook globally, I guess you would say. My struggles are more like internal, free flowing for no reason kind of, mental stuff. But so I think I'm a hopeful person, but I guess I feel like, we've come through so much and we've made it through that. And human beings are phenomenal and capable of anything that we want, and the potential is unlimited. And I think that just remembering that, like whatever it is, we figure it out eventually. So that gives me hope. And just seeing all the people coming back to the studio, and still, even now, there are some people who are still just coming back to their first class, but I can't tell you how many times over the last couple months, someone has come up to me after class just bawling and saying, this is my first in-person class back.
Yeah.
And they've been doing it online, like all of us were. And, you forget, they all say the same thing. I forgot. Like, I thought I'm just doing it online, and it's good. It's great. I'm like, that's fine. But when you come and you're with people and you're breathing together and you're moving together and you're singing together, it's easy to forget. And when they come back, it's just, they're so overwhelmed with gratitude and hope. So I think, us coming back together, being together, seeing each other, loving each other, forgiving each other. There's like a huge labor shortage, and there's still a lot of residual issues. And so, like, be kind when the service is slow, be kind when the person behind the desk is crabby, but they're the only person on staff, and so, just to be grateful and be kind. And so that gives me hope. Like, us being able to come back together and slowly piece everything back together gives me a lot of hope. And I just generally sort of believe in people. But that also comes from the yoga practice. I have to say, that also comes from the yoga practice. And the other, aspect of the practice that always gives me hope is I am, a believer in sort of this greater, consciousness that we're all part of. And so I don't suffer. I don't suffer the finite as much, I'd say. And so that's something that I turn to often, is just knowing that I'm really part of something infinite. And, it's just this constant cycle of, creation and sustaining and destruction, and it never ends. And that's, our day, and that's our life, and that's our breath. It's everything. So.
Right. It's all the cycles. You were talking about opportunity in there. And I remember when you were opening Love Story in San Francisco, you said something about, like, if you want something like this, like, it's no problem. Just like ask for it, and like lean in that direction and see what shows up. Cause like you said, you've founded this whole studio, but it's a team of people. It's more than just this one singular consciousness. It's a collective, it's a collection and a collective that creates something. And I know a lot of people who want to create a healing center and have this vision, and then also have, as we do, right, the resistance along the way, or it's too good to be true, or it's never going to happen, or I can't find the resources. And I think tapping into that sense of being a part of a greater whole can help ease the burden of feeling like I have to do everything, and can help just with that feeling of possibility and hope of like, well, let me just lean into this wanting, or let me lean into this curiosity or this dream or whatever it is, and just, take a few steps in that direction, which can be really scary, but can also be amazing. I mean, then years later, you have folks coming up and crying because they're finally back in person. I mean, you never would foresee any of that at the
Oh,
beginning, and there's so much that it takes to create something like you've created, but it's possible, right?
I think it's important to just, for most of anything in a relationship, in my career, in whatever that has been successful, it's been more about me just saying yes than pushing or reaching, or and then after yes, there's a lot of work usually. But it has mostly been about me saying yes and being open to the opportunity and being curious, and that's kind of, I think, gives you this great momentum.
Yes, 100%. It totally does. Yes. Yeah. Even this podcast, I was like, yes. And here we are. What's coming up for you next? Are there any you're getting back in person, any big plans on the horizon?
In full swing. We start teacher training in January in San Francisco. Then we have teacher training starting in Larkspur in Marin February, and that'll be like a once a month program. I'm really excited about that in modules. And yeah, I have a retreat in Mexico that's sold out, but I'm going to be in London, and I haven't been in like 3 years. So I'm so excited to finally go back. I'll be there March 17th to 19th. So I'm really excited about that. And I'll teach the Devi Mahatmyam, which is a beautiful text that I'm really deep in right now. So yeah, all that, and, trying to raise some good human beings and take care of an amazing dog who takes care of me mostly.
Yes, so good. Well, I will hopefully see you in person October 1st. So we'll talk about some of the things we talked about today and all kinds of fun stuff. And I'm really excited for in person too, because hugs, for whoever's comfortable with them, hugs are just amazing. And that energy that comes from physically being in a group is just palpable.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of science around that though, too.
Yeah.
And about singing in a group and that kind of thing too.
Yes, all of the above.
Eh,
Definitely discussion and asana, and definitely some anchor points of, things that help the practice be healing, things we can anchor to as we're searching for our own resilience. I mean, we talked about a lot of those little tidbits here too. But yeah, I mean, this is something we talked about. Like, I really believe that when we understand trauma, it's hard not to have compassion for other people, because you just sort of see, I mean, if you know their history, that helps too, but you also get to recognize patterns of how people respond to trauma. And then you might just be, at ordering lunch or something at a cafe, and someone's like really tense. And then instead of being like, oh, well, that person's this and that, you're like, oh, they're carrying a lot of tension right now. Like, I wonder what they're going through. Right.
yeah.
So you start to notice, like, when we go hyper arousal, when we go hypo arousal, what we do in response to hard things. And then it's just harder. It's harder to not have compassion for people. It's easier just to feel a little bit of that softening in your heart. So,
And that softness to begin with comes from doing your own practice and your own work, like you said, with your own trauma. And I want to say one other thing, because I teach the kleshas a lot, which the trauma comes up with that. There's psycho-emotional triggers. And, I always say to everyone in the group that, everyone has trauma. Life is traumatizing. Like, if you've been born, that's traumatic, okay? Like, coming into the world is traumatic. So I also like to just sort of like normalize that word and let everybody know that we all have stuff that we're dealing with, everybody. And that's the compassion piece too.
and once we learn about it, then we see it. Because if we just think of trauma as a concept, maybe we were like, oh, PTSD, well, I haven't been to war. And then we'll learn, like, what is trauma and how does it impact us? We're like, well, that seems like me, and that seems like my family, and that seems like my friends, and that seems like everybody I know. And why don't we all know this? It's like, yeah, exactly. This is really helpful information, that there is that informational component, that like psychoeducation. You're just like, oh, this is how we work. And then it just normalizes so much. I mean, even in terms of mental health diagnoses, it just normalizes so much. And then we just go, oh, you have a body. Oh, you're a human. Welcome to the club.
Work you're doing is so important, and I'm so glad that you're out there doing it. And yeah, just to sort of normalize a lot of this. And I love the movement of neurodiversity. Is that what they're calling it now? Like, I'm a big believer in that. It's, I guess because systems have a hard time, dealing with lots of different diverse learners and emotional, psychological, but I think that's probably why. But I mean, it's, that we're all very diverse in that way too. And we just have to learn, like you said, like how our brain works, what's going on and why, and then we can move from there. So I love that you're doing this work, and I'm so glad that you're out there doing it.
Yes, and I'm so glad to be doing it in person at Love Story. That's going to be really, really nice. I can't remember the last time I was there in San Francisco. I think it was like New Year's Eve. A couple of friends, we went to
Years ago then.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. It was definitely pre-pandemic. I don't know, 2018 maybe. We did like a New Year's Eve practice there. It was sweaty. It was nice.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Steph. It's wonderful to have you here and to see your face. And I so look forward to seeing you in person, giving you a hug. And thanks for everything you've done to create healing spaces in the world. I know it makes a big difference. And I know you're human and dealing with all this stuff too. And so I just think it's a beautiful thing to create that space to share what you've experienced in a healing way. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so good to see you.
Thanks so much for listening. My hope is that you walk away from these episodes feeling supported and like you have a place to come to find the hope and inspiration you need to take your next small step forward. For more information and resources, please visit howwecanheal.com. There, you'll find tons of helpful resources and the full transcript of each show. Thanks so much for your messages, feedback, and ideas about the podcast. I love hearing from you, and I so appreciate your support. There are lots of ways you can support the show, and I'm grateful for every little bit of love you share. If you love the show, please leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, Audible, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe on YouTube to get updates every week. You can always visit howwecanheal.com/podcast to share your thoughts and ideas. I love hearing from you, so keep your comments coming. If you'd like to stay connected in between episodes, you can also text me. Text the word HEAL to 888-858-0811. That's 888-858-0811. I went for the number with a lot of 8s in it. I'll send you some inspiration and support a few times a month, and you can text me back there too. Before we wrap up, I want to be clear that this podcast isn't offering any prescriptions. It's not advice or any kind of diagnosis. Your decisions are in your hands, and we encourage you to consult with any relevant healthcare professionals you may need to support you through your unique path of healing. I'd also like to send thanks to our guests today, to Christine O'Donnell and Celine Baumgartner of Bright-Sided Podcasting, and to everyone who helped support this podcast directly and indirectly. Alex, thanks for taking the dogs out while I record. Lastly, I'd love to give a shout out to my big brother, Matt, who passed away in 2002. He wrote this music, and it makes my heart so happy to share it with you now.